Remember these headlines? Last year, a brilliant Ukrainian military offensive was about to overrun Russia's Kursk region and place the brave Ukrainian army within 550 kilometers of Moscow. Yeah, I didn't get it either. What was the point? Why incur the horrific human and logistical cost of trying to hold on to a target that didn't hold much strategic value and was never going to be a defendable position realistically anyway, in this ridiculously uneven fight between the world's foremost nuclear power and a patch of plucky farmland next door? Well, it turns out the farmland in question might have been more valuable than many of us realized, and those behind the scenes who were responsible for pushing it into the world's most unwinnable war might have been playing 3D chess. As the so-called Kursk offensive falls into ruins, with even official Ukrainian sources admitting heavy casualties and mass retreats earlier this week, it is increasingly becoming clear that both Joe Biden's openly pro-war position and Donald Trump's supposedly anti-war position on Ukraine have one thing in common: lots and lots of dead Ukrainians. Apparently, when they said we will fight to the last Ukrainian, they really meant it. For those of us who live in the global south, of course, this is nothing new. It's not an isolated incident and unfortunate war, but it's actually just the latest installment in a long and time-honored tradition of Western war machines using the soldiers and people of their non-Western, non-sovereign allies as cannon fodder in planned military action. When you examine multiple historical instances, even cursorily, you can't not notice that when Western war machines use proxy armies or non-Western allies in their wars, a suspicious pattern inevitably emerges where proxies and allies do all the suffering and dying, while those from the Imperial Court generally tend to go home significantly wealthier after the war. This goes all the way back to the Second World War, when British and French colonial governments conscripted hundreds of thousands of young men from Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Nepal, Kenya, and other places to serve the various war theaters across Europe, East Asia, and the Horn of Africa, in places such as France, Burma, and Ethiopia. Now, these were some of the most brutal and deadly battles of the Second World War. But when the survivors came home, they all had one experience in common. Their military pensions, if they were paid at all, were significantly less than those of the white European veterans from the same wars. Bear in mind that these soldiers had typically been used at the front line, effectively serving as human shields for their white European counterparts. And after surviving this, the government then found themselves earning much less than these people that they had shielded. By the way, this issue was never resolved. As recently as last year, Nepalese Gurkha soldiers who fought for Britain were still protesting for the right to receive the same pensions as their white counterparts. This was 2024, not 1954. Now, to add insult to injury, many war veterans from Kenya came home from World War II only to find out that their land had been expropriated by the British government and given to white war veterans who had settled in Kenya. In other words, they had put their lives on the line for the very people who ended up stealing their economic potential and locking their descendants into generational poverty. Nearly all of that land remains in white hands till now, by the way, and you don't need a soothsayer to tell you that the racialized poverty dynamics of Kenya have not changed at all since then. But it gets worse. Ghanaian and Senegalese war veterans returned home only to see their promised pensions left completely unpaid for years. So they took to the streets of Accra and Dakar in protest against the broken promises by the British and French colonial governments. The British and French responded by shooting them dead in the streets. These men had survived the brutal Germans and Japanese in Europe and Asia, only to come home to a massacre at the hands of those who had called them allies and made all sorts of promises to them. More recently, in 2021, during the US retreat from Afghanistan, after decades of drastically altering the social and political character of the country via Mujahideen and other proxy fighting forces that were initially meant to fight the Soviets, all the American citizens and their pet animals were safely evacuated from Kabul. But for many of the Afghan employees, fixers, and collaborators, there was no space on the evacuation flights, and that happened. Point is, Ukraine is simply the latest reboot of this movie. Once again, a non-Western population has been convinced by Western allies to fight and die on someone else's behalf. And once again, the outcome of the war shows two inescapable realities. First, that there really is no plan for Ukrainian survivors, because the entire purpose of Ukrainians in this war was to be expendable chunks of organic foreign policy. And second, that only the so-called Western allies will emerge from all this with a victory. That is, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of land and minerals. The more things change.